Family and fellow soldiers, I'm the Professor, and this is the Moment of Truth. I think it's a good time for us to check in with Biden's campaign. Here's how it started, and here's how it's going.
The White House is vowing not to, quote, make the mistake of underestimating a key group that helped propel Biden to victory in 2020. In a new interview with NBC News, Biden's principal deputy campaign manager acknowledged that for the president to win again in 2024, his team, quote, has to have a long, sustained conversations with African Americans in their communities and can't simply, quote, parachute in around election time.
No.
This comes after a recent survey from the New York Times and Siena College showed Biden's seating support from Black battleground state voters to Robert F. Kennedy Jr. For more on that, let's bring in opinion editor at The Washington Post, Alexi McCammond. Her latest piece is entitled, Democrats Need to Get Real, about RFK Jr.'s strength with Black voters. Alexi, where is it coming from?
Hey, well, thank you so much for having me. I mean, I think what Joe said is right. So a couple of disclaimers off the top. Polls are not gospel. It's a year out, and Black voters are not a monolith. But one thing that is clear in polling trends, focus group trends, and otherwise is that Black voters and other voters are looking for an alternative. Black voters have long felt and said and showed us that they feel taken for granted by the Democratic Party. We've seen the ways in which VP Harris hasn't been supported as much as some folks would like by the Democratic Party, by President Biden. And the real kicker with RFK Jr., and something that is particularly unique to him, is that he taps into this deep-seated, deep-rooted medical skepticism that a lot of Black folks across the country feel, rightfully so. There has been medical racism going back, to the 1800s through now. There is ample reason why folks might feel distrustful of their healthcare providers or of what even the government is telling us we should do with our bodies with respect to vaccines.
So don't you think that some of what Robert's growing popularity or growing support among some Blacks is because he's not been challenged by the Biden supporters on some of the things that he says that are completely out of line with the way a lot of Blacks think?
And I think that, Black voters are hearing a lot from RFK Jr. about other things beyond vaccines. And I think that's the big issue. He's couching a lot of this stuff in terms of civil rights, as I'm sure you know, Rev. And he's also talking a lot like Milei, who was just elected in Argentina, this sort of populist rhetoric that's painting a very hopeful vision for the future.
The lesson that's being learned here, well, probably not being learned at all, but the lesson that they should be learning is that Biden isn't going to BS and bluff his way past the Black vote this time. There is no substitute for the moral legitimacy that Black people represent in the historical sphere, and there is no substitute for the Black vote in the political sphere. Now, first off, it began with Black men saying, you know what, this Biden guy, he ain't getting our support. The white media tried to ignore that for a good long while. They saw these big black storm clouds forming on the horizon, and they tried to stick their heads back in the sand. See, that's why they spent all those years trying to counter this truth by attempting to stroke Black women's egos, just to see if it would work. Because if Black men were saying this, well, maybe Black women were thinking it too, so they need to shore up their support, they thought. This is where all of the phony praise and the insincere compliments towards Black women for the last 3 or 4 years came from. Having these bootlicks saying that Black women are the backbone of the Democratic Party, but at no point did they ever say what they were going to do for Black women. They just assumed that all they had to do was just give Black women a pat on the head and that Black women would obey, but that hasn't been what's happening. So now we see that they're having to admit that it's the Black vote in general that is migrating away from Joe Biden and by extension from the Democratic Party. Of course, they got this woman here who works for the Washington Post, so of course she's going to say the tripe about Black voters don't like how Kamala Harris isn't being supported by the administration. That's just pure crackhead talk. Black voters didn't even support Kamala when she ran for president. She's just a puppet, an invention of the California political machine. White power made her who she is. Nobody other than Sonny Hostin and the Black sorority set are going to be unhappy about how the administration is sidelining Harris. That woman proves every day that the only thing she's qualified to do was to be low-down Willie Brown's plaything. She puts her foot in her mouth every time she opens it. I chronicled for you how her stint as vice president quickly became a train wreck. She brought in a new, read white PR team to be her communications staff, and it looks like their advice to her was just stay out of public view. This is the white media, so they're not going to be saying anything about reparations or about how Biden's meager, largely pointless political promises that he made during the 2020 election cycle, like the so-called Lift Every Voice plan and his White House Police Accountability Commission, how he went back on all of it. He reneged on all of his campaign promises before he was even sworn into office. I told you back in 2020 that trying to scare black people with the threat of 4 more years of Trump was a trick they would only get to pull once. And now, the bill has come due. And of course, you gotta have Al Sharpton here. This is how the white media operates. Gotta make sure you put some black preacher out there. These civil rights fossils who are scared because the only reason the white media even let these shills hang around is because their job is to prove that they can control and manipulate us. But what's happening is we're showing we can't be manipulated and we won't be controlled. This is why Roly-Poly is constantly cursing at us and insulting us. But we're showing that these bootlicks don't control anything. The days of sending in some preacher man pulpit pimp or some 2-bit activist to lead us around by the nose is over. This segment was basically to take shots at RFK Jr., because while absolutely none of these political candidates is for us, white supremacy does have its separate camps, and each one of them has people that they happen to favor. So whenever they see a Ralph Nader or a Bernie Sanders or a Donald Trump who comes along as a political spoiler, they're going to get bombed on, not because they're good for us, not because they won't toe the line for white power, but because this or that particular white media outlet isn't best buds with them. Now, on a side note, if Fani Willis is able to get Trump convicted, don't be surprised if Governor Kemp immediately pardons him. That guy's desperate to get into the upper echelons of GOP power, and doing something big and audacious like pardoning Trump instantly, that's just the thing to ingratiate himself to the MAGA set, so watch out for that. And you gotta love seeing Mika the Bigot Brzezinski squirm and hear her huffing off camera, all of that sighing stuff. That bottled blonde worm. I was just waiting for one of those clowns on the panel to say, after everything's Biden's done for black voters, they're not going to vote for him. Far as they're concerned, Biden hasn't said the N-word, at least he hasn't been caught on camera doing it, so to them, black people should be kissing his wrinkled feet. If black voters are looking for an alternative to Biden, shouldn't the clowns at MSNBC have known about this a long time before now? Shouldn't they have been giving daily updates on that? But they weren't. And also, that word alternative that they're using, that's white media weasel words. I'll explain why in a minute. The white media understands their job. It's to tell lies, carpet bomb us with these lies, attack anyone who dares to disagree, and then sit back and watch while the allegedly ignorant black masses do the white media's bidding. Or at the very least, hopefully we'll be so confused by their propaganda that we won't stay on our square. And to be honest, that tactic has largely been successful. But now, the old tricks, they don't seem to be working the same way they used to. Remember when Bloomberg ran for president back in 2020, the white media said that his stop and frisk policy wasn't hurting him with black voters. And why was that? Because Bloomberg held a rally where he had some sellout black mayors say that they supported him. These are the kind of political tactics that he and others used in New York. They would just pay some black preachers or activists to speak up for them or promise to give them and their family members jobs when they get to higher office, and they'll go and tell the black community that this white racist politician over here is all right. Bloomberg figured if it was good enough for New York City, then it would work nationally. But national politics are not the same as New York politics, no matter how important the Big Apple is. It was black voters at Brown Chapel AME Church in Birmingham who literally turned their backs on Bloomberg and killed his presidential campaign in a single instant. And the same white media who had been claiming that stop and frisk hadn't hurt him with black voters, just a few days after that incident, they had to write his political obituary and admit stop and frisk killed his presidential campaign. So the white media knows that their so-called reporting are just lies meant to mislead us. What they don't know is whether we're swallowing the lies. That's why they don't talk about us. This is the first time in forever that I can recall Scarborough talking about black voters. He didn't need to bring in some cupcake from the Washington Post to white-splain to us. Scarborough normally does all the talking on his show himself, so why did he think he needed to ask somebody else about this one? Shouldn't he and the rest of that kindergarten he calls his panel already have been talking about this years before now? Shouldn't they have been given daily updates about Biden supporters slipping more? He's got a problem. But they haven't. In fact, Scarborough's been saying exactly the opposite. Things are just fine. What, me worry? How did this catch them unawares? Because they know as the white media, their job is not to report the black opinion. Their job is to dictate our opinion to us. And that includes these claims that black voters are looking for an alternative and that they're gravitating towards RFK Jr. See, that's a hell of an assumption to be making. First of all, I don't see black people breaking for RFK Jr. I don't know anyone who's even talking about him. He's not talking about reparations or anything else of interest to us. And no, I don't know any black people who are hot and bothered about vaccines at this late date. That's more of a white right-wing talking point. That's more of an issue for the white right. And if, as this woman in Al Sharpton tried to claim, the issue was an underlying concern that black people have about healthcare, what did RFK Jr. even say about healthcare? I haven't heard him say anything. And apparently neither have any of the people at MSNBC, because they never actually talked about what RFK Jr. was going to do on healthcare for black people. Instead, they just went round and around in rhetorical circles about vaccines and black people not trusting the white healthcare system, but at no point did anyone say what RFK Jr. promised to do about it that was allegedly striking a chord with black voters. This talk about an alternative that black people are looking for, this is just white media spin. Because up until now, they've been trying to lie and say that black voters were going to the Republican Party. Black voters were trending towards Trump. But that's not true either. Just because black people are saying that they don't want to vote for Biden doesn't mean that we feel like we have to vote for someone else. We don't. The white media wants you to feel like you have to vote for someone regardless. You need to look for an alternative. If Biden's not doing it for you, well, you need to vote for someone. And why is that? Because as I've always told you, people who are voting are not in revolt. When people decide to give up on the ballot box, that doesn't mean that they give up on making political changes. It means they do it by methods other than voting. That's what the 2020 uprisings were about. This is the white media basically telling Biden that he needs to try to throw us some more crumbs and see if we fall for it. All the empty PR gestures he did, making Kamala Harris VP, putting Ketanji Brown on the Supreme Court, and what's-her-name as UN ambassador, these were supposed to be his way to dodge our demands. All the phony white media propaganda stories falsely claiming that, well, the reason that black voters are souring on Biden is because they're concerned about LGBT issues or inflation. Yeah, the white media is slowly but surely having to drop those asinine talking points. Now, there's something else we need to remember. Just because these white supremacist tricks didn't work doesn't mean they're going to stop trying it. Just last week, the white media had one of these foreign tethers putting out an old propaganda talking point about closing the wealth gap, but for black women. They're still trying to drive that gender divide at this late date. They see the pressure that we're putting on them, and they need to find a way to get black people to split from one another, and since gender warring worked in the past, they're doing it again. They want to get us to turn on each other. Because the one thing these tethers and these black feminists never talk about is reparations. See, when your goal in life is to be Gloria Steinem, complete with bottle blonde bunny ruckus hairdo, you don't want to make the white feminist angry. You identify with them because you want to be one of them. Not just be a feminist, but to be a white feminist. So you talk about irrelevant things like patriarchy and class struggle and intersectionality and male privilege and other gibberish that has no bearing on the black experience at all. The only time these feminists mention white supremacy, they always make sure to frame it in terms of the so-called patriarchy. They always shoehorn that term into the discussion. You force them to talk about white supremacy. Well, that's part of patriarchy. It's part of the patriarchy. They just lapse into the same old shop-worn spiel about male privilege, etc. They never talk about white supremacy. They always deflect. They deflect onto gender or class because they know that what their white feminist masters want them to do is to dispel the energy and protect the status quo. The racial wealth gap is based on color, not gender, and there's no amount of bootlicking or sucking up to white power that's going to change that. Anyone who you see trying to claim that black women have special needs apart and separate from the black community, that's someone who always is claiming that black women aren't really part of the black community. You see, for these hood rats and these dried-out, bitter wannabe black feminists, that idea appeals to them. They like that idea. They love the idea that they can escape blackness somehow, and that's why the feminist talking points that black women are somehow separate from black society always tickles their ears. They love it. It's suicidal. That's what it is, because these white supremacists aren't offering black women anything but an early grave. Black women sided with the feminists in the 1960s, and how did that turn out? So understand, that's what's going on here, the old divide and conquer. The white supremacists on the left are scared that black people as a group are demanding tangibles, and they're terrified that this is going to become the new normal. They're hoping to wait us out, stall for time, change the subject, see if they can get us to turn on each other, whatever it takes. So the white media is realizing that they're not able to dictate black people's opinions to us this time. And they don't need to say that the black grassroots is the reason why. We know we're the reason why. They hear us, and they fear us. They've been hoping that Biden's drop in black support would bottom out at some point, and that he would start to recover, but it's not happening. They don't need black voters to vote Republican in order for Biden to lose. All it would take is 15 to 20% of black voters merely staying home, and he's done for. They've been spending all this time trying to make us think that they were going to be switching to some other group. They were going to be cobbling together some new voter base from all of these non-black groups. That's why we saw the white media pushing all those headlines about everybody else. And now look what Biden's been reduced to. Well, my advice for Biden is that since he spent all his time repping abortion and illegal immigration and LGBT issues and Asian hate crime laws, that's fine. Since that's who he sees as his constituency, that's who he needs to keep talking to. He's already seen that the same conservative suburban white women who were willing to vote to keep abortion legal are not willing to vote to keep him in office. This ridiculous project by the DNC to manufacture a new voter base from these other non-black groups isn't working. What Biden needs is an enthusiastic black electorate to save him, but he doesn't have it this time. He told us lies, he ignored us, he condescended to us. But that doesn't mean that we're going to vote for the GOP. What it does mean, though, is we're going to support Biden the exact same way he supported us. Good day, and be one. I'd like to take a moment to mention some of our contributors. Sherman Marshall, Kenetha Wade, Jimmy Whitfield, Cyberdyne 100, and Josiah Starr. Salute to them and thank you to everyone for listening, liking, and sharing this message. Black empowerment only exists because of you.